At this time, I'd like to recognize the other members of the team, particularly our hosts for this evening, and I'm going to ask them to stand so that you'll know whom to thank personally. Hagan and Nelda, would you please stand? Please show your appreciation for our primary hosts, Nelda and Hagan Codell. Assisting Nelda and Hagan have been Hagan's siblings and their spouses. They are Jimmy and Jeannie Codell, David and Allison Codell, and Alice Codell Roberts. I'd also like to recognize Kathy and Harkey Edwards, who hosted some of you for lunch today at their beautiful vineyard. We just had a wonderful time down there. Thank you. Many of you have thanked me for organizing this reunion, but the organization and promotion of this reunion was not done by me or any other person. It was done by the mere idea of it. The French poet Victor Hugo said, "There is nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come." There's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. When you stop and reflect, hasn't this idea of this reunion been on our minds for a long time? We, all of us here, have known that we have Codell relatives whom we didn't know but wished we could. We knew that there were other Codells who came from Calitri, Italy, and who were the brother and sister of our grandparents. While none of these grandparents could still be living, we knew that there were their descendants who were our cousins, some as close as second cousins. Haven't we all wondered who these other cousins were? Where did they live? What were they like? Am I at all like them? How can I go about trying to meet them? So the idea of this reunion has been simmering for many years. Its time has come, it's powerful, and we get to enjoy it this weekend. Soon, several of us will describe our ancestors, but first, let me put these ancestors in context. Mary Angela, Gaetano, James, formerly known as Pasquale, Lucia, and Vincenza were a family of 5 children raised by Rose and Michaela Codella in Calitri during the late 1800s. Unfortunately, we know very little about the oldest child, Mary Angela, or about her descendants. But I'm going to spend some time in my upcoming retirement trying to find them, and perhaps some of you can help me do it.
Yeah.
What we do know is that 3 of the 4 children, James, Gaetano, and Vincenza, immigrated to the United States in the early 1900s when they were the respective ages of 15, 22, and 16. Mary Angela and Lucia remained in Italy. All of these ancestors are interesting in at least 2 respects, in my opinion. The 3 who immigrated came when they were quite young. For them, the U.S. was a distant, foreign country with a different language. They came with few possessions but many hopes. Their story, in many ways, is the story of the American dream. The second respect is the parents and the 2 siblings who remained in Italy. Think about it. They gave up their loved ones to the uncertainty of the new world. They did not know if they would ever see them again. Their story, the story of the ones who remained, is one of great sacrifice. They sacrificed to further the dreams of those who left. It is a sacrifice which must be acknowledged and honored, and we will do so tonight. What you will hear next are stories of success, some of which are well documented and well known. But I ask you to listen carefully for the other stories, the stories of sacrifice and love, the stories that do not result in titles, trophies, or tons of money. These other stories are the stories that build strong families, the stories that put the idea of union in our reunion. As mentioned earlier, an important supporter of this reunion is Jimmy Codell. Jimmy is our host Hagan's brother and is the oldest grandchild of our ancestor James Codell, whom he's going to tell you about. So please welcome Jimmy.
Thank you, George. Let me preface my remarks by saying George kind of put me on the sideline when he did all this welcoming and recognizing everyone. But I want to tell each and every one of you just happy, how excited we are to have you here with us. Really, we couldn't wait till you got here. And they're trying to get me in front of the microphone. I'm really a polished public speaker, unlike the lawyers you just heard. But anyway, we are excited that you're here, and we ordered this weather. It's always like this in Kentucky. I mean, that's the reason we call it the Promised Land. But no, seriously, it is a beautiful weekend, and we're so glad that you're here with us to enjoy. Let me go back a second and talk about the guy that really put this thing together, and that's the guy that just preceded me. George Brooks has done one whale of a job doing this. George, thank you. George recognized my siblings and told you, so I won't go through all that again. But I'm going to talk about Pasquale Codella, James Codell. Our grandfather, a lot of us in their grandfather. I called him Papaw, so from now on, it's going to be Papaw. So he came to the U.S. in 1901. His parents didn't want him to come. 15 years old, he wanted to live the American dream. He told them, or he convinced them, and they didn't have any money, and he convinced them that he would pay them back if they would let him come to the States. And he did come to the States. When he came to the States, he lived with his uncle, Leonard Capicello, who took a lot of Italians in, and played a huge role. And I've heard my grandmother and my Papa and Mama talk about him all my life, all their lives. It's wonderful. He had a shoe shop, or was a cobbler behind in an Italian enclave behind the Capitol. But the Capicellos must be credited for making this whole evening possible. Really, they really did. One of his first jobs was helping lay the floor in the Willard Hotel, which is still there. And Jeannie and I've seen it, and a lot of us have seen it. It's unbelievable. And legend has it that Papaw said when he married Mama, he was going to take her there on his honeymoon. And I'm really not sure that we can attest to that, but I know that they visited there over the years. When Papaw came to the U.S., the railroads were booming, just taking off. And he got his first job as a laborer, constructed the old Dominion line over in Virginia, then became a superintendent, and struck the NW from D.C. out to Great Falls. Then he tackled a quarry stripping job. He stripped the quarry and got it ready to blast rock. And he walked away with a profit of $3,000, and that put him on his way. And he started his first firm, started the firm in 1908, building a stretch of railroad for the Mason Hanger Company over in Virginia. But, you know, I'm sitting here and extolling my grandfather's virtues, but in my opinion, his biggest accomplishment was meeting and marrying my grandmother. My grandmother, Codell, was unbelievable. She really was. She was just a wonderful lady. She was, at the time she died, I think she was the oldest living female graduate of Marshall, what then was Marshall College's Marshall University in Huntington. But there was a bit of unrest, if you would, when he married her, because here she was, college graduate, an educator, marrying someone with little or no education, none. But it is what it is, and it worked out for the best. It really did. He changed his name from Pasquale to James over the years, and I know when my father was born, they wanted to name him James Codell Jr. So my grandfather always called himself JC, was James Codell. He didn't have a middle name. So they tried to determine what they were going to name. If he's going to name him Junior, what's going to be his middle name? So they selected Calloway, which was my grandmother Codell's maiden name, and so that's where it came from. And that's my middle name. That's Jim's middle name, and that's his son's middle name. But we were fortunate enough to work on highways, dams, site work all over the place in Kentucky, Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, and all, and even worked overseas and numerous jobs over the years. But in the early 90s, we left the grade and drain business and went into the construction management business, building schools and jails and courthouses. And Jim and brother David have run that company. David's retired now, it's Jim's running it. And they've done quite a bit of work for, like I say, quite a few jails, quite a few schools and courthouses, and done quite a bit of work over at the University of Kentucky, as well as Pikeville University up in Eastern Kentucky. Papaw was extremely active in the Disciples of Christ Church, First Christian Church. And he, not only through his service to the church, his philanthropy, he was a real warm, hospitable individual. He built a clubhouse out on the Colby Road near the farm, and he entertained clients, and then we had Christmases out there, many Christmases over the years. Wonderful family outings. But and back to my grandmother, I'll tell you a tale about her. I was talking about her a while ago. My grandmother had a pretty heavy foot. I mean, she drove pretty fast. And so in her later years, she had some heart problems, and so my father and his siblings tried to ground her, if you would. And so she would call Dad, and she'd say, well, Billy Brooks or Bev White would sung my keys. And then, the fact of the matter, I got credit for stealing a time or two. but I know one time Jeannie and I were driving out the road, and my grandmother went by us like a bat out of Hades. And I mean, she was something else. But as I said, she was a wonderful person, and I'll never forget her. And back to the clubhouse. The clubhouse sat there on where they used to entertain, and Hagen's got the stone out of the fireplace and put it in his house here, and it's beautiful, and the whole place is beautiful, by the way. But he was loved, and my grandfather was loved and respected by everybody. I'd like to read you the inscription on his monument, and it says, he has achieved success, who has lived well, liked often, and loved much, who has gained the respect of intelligent men and the love of little children, who has fulfilled his niche and accomplished his task, who has left the world better than he found it, who has always looked for the best in others and given the best he had, whose life was an inspiration, whose memory a benediction. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. One of the two ancestors who remained in Calitri was Lucia, as I mentioned before. Coming to tell you about her is Beverly Shea, whom we call Boo. Boo lives with her husband Mike in nearby Richmond, Kentucky. And over the years, they've raised many exotic birds. So if you want to know about exotic birds, this lady right here knows it all. She's also the grandchild of James Codell, so please welcome Boo.
Jimmy, I wanted to tell you that, of course, you all lived here on Van Meter Road, but we lived on Colby Road, and it was our lives who were in danger from Memo's heavy foot. What I'm going to read to you about Lucia Codella was prepared by her great-grandson, Fabio, with some help from George. Fabio, who was born and raised in Calitri, could not be here tonight. He is a full professor of the University of Montreal in Canada, where he teaches chemical engineering. His sister Valeria, who also intended to be here but was unable to attend, works in the European Laboratory of Particle Physics. Lucia Codella was born in Calitri on February 25, 1888. She married very young, and her husband died soon after. They had no children. She later married Giuseppe Metallo and had 2 children, a daughter Angela in 1913 and son Canio in 1915. Giuseppe was drafted into the Italian army to fight with the Allies during World War I and was killed in action in 1916. So by the time she was 28, Lucia had lost 2 husbands and was left to rear 2 children who were aged 1 and 3 as a single parent. She was living in an Italian mountain town whose economy was still suffering from the war. Lucia's only source of income was a modest war widow's pension. She lived with her children in a small apartment in Calitri and raised much of their food, wheat, corn, vegetables, and grapes, on a plot of land outside of town. At some point, she managed to purchase a female donkey to transport her gardening tools, crops, and herself to and from the garden. George wasn't able to learn the name of the donkey. However, my sister Judy has 2 miniature donkeys, and the female is named Speck, so I'll call this donkey Speck. Family lore has it that Speck memorized the way home and the customary stops that Lucia would make on the way home to visit with family and friends. Often, Speck would get ahead of Lucia, but would wait faithfully for her at the next stop. Speck was a family pet, of course, in addition to being a much-needed work animal. Lucia's son, Canio, left Italy shortly before September 1939 outbreak of World War II in Europe, when he was about age 24. He reportedly left Italy on one of the last ships leaving for the U.S. from the port of Naples. Canio's trip was made possible by his Uncle James or Uncle Gaetano, we're not sure which, and he settled in the U.S. permanently. George reports finding Canio's 1940 U.S. draft registration online, which lists his home as Washington, D.C. His next of kin is listed as John Capicella, and his employer as Codell Construction Company. The Capicellos were an important landing place for all of our ancestors who newly arrived in this country. At the age of 16, Lucia's daughter Angela married Norris Cuccinello, who had come to Calitri to manage the town's first electrical system. They had 5 children, 3 of whom are still living in Calitri. Josephine, who's age 88, and is Fabio's mother. Giuseppe, who's 86, and Olga, who is 78. When George and his family had dinner with these 3 grandchildren of Lucia in 2012, Giuseppe said that he had an unpleasant chore of having to find Aunt Rosemary and Uncle Bill, Brooks, George and Betsy's parents, who were stationed in Europe after the war in 1948. The unpleasantness of the chore was having to tell Aunt Rosemary that her father, James Codell, had passed away. During the middle of the last century, Lucia's grandchildren were of school age, but her daughter Angela believed that the schools in Calitri were substandard, and she wanted her children to be better educated in Naples, about 80 miles away. Though Lucia had never lived anywhere but Calitri during the first 60 years of her life, she moved with Angela's family to Naples to help rear the children and further their education. Her efforts contributed to Josephine becoming an English teacher, Olga becoming a pediatric doctor, and Giuseppe becoming a chemistry technician who owned and operated a lab in Calitri. They called their loving grandmother Mama Chia for short, and they were at her bedside when she died in 1972 at the age of 93. Lucia can be summed up by noting that she lived most of her life in a small Italian town and struggled to survive as a single parent of 2 small children. She sacrificed for their benefit and the benefits of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. As you've heard, Lucia's descendants were successful and highly productive citizens. Her sacrifice paid off, and it's a privilege to honor her memory this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Boo. Next, we will hear about Gaetano from William Codell, who lives in Frankfort, Kentucky, our capital. William is the great-grandson of Gaetano and the son of Mike and Cindy Codell, who are here tonight. Finally, some of you may not be aware that William recently brought a new member into our family when he married Pamela Feltz this June. So welcome to you, Pamela. Please show your appreciation for William, who will share about Gaetano.
Thank you, George. Good evening. As George said, I'm William Codell. For those of you all who may not know me, I'm Mike and Cindy Codell's son. In my career, I get to give presentations on a somewhat regular basis. I've traveled throughout Kentucky. I've given presentations in Paducah and Pikeville and most of the places in between throughout this Commonwealth. I've even gone to Washington, D.C. and California to give presentations. Wanted to say here at the very start that through all of my travels and all of the various presentations I've done in all the different groups, this presentation tonight, at the risk of revealing my ego or my arrogance, I've got to say that this group of people that I'm related to is the best looking crowd that I've ever spoken to. We've definitely got some good genetics going here. The information that I'm going to speak about with Gaetano Codella was prepared by my mom, Cindy Codell, and I'm kind of reading from her notes. She had some issues with eyesight, so I'm a poor stand-in for her. I wish you all could hear her speak. She's a very articulate and talented public speaker, but I'll do the best I can here. Gaetano Codella was my great-grandfather. He was born July 26 in 1882 in Italy. He was born to Michael Codella and Rose Castoni Codella. At the age of 22, he married Angelina Valerio Codella, who was born September 25th, 1883 in Calitri, which is in Avellino, Italy. Eventually, expecting a baby, the couple made a decision to move to America and to pursue a new life. When I was reviewing the history of Gaetano, that really struck me. I really admire his courage, his willingness to take on change, and his willingness to take on that type of risk. Currently, my wife, Pamela, is pregnant, and I cannot imagine in this circumstance making the decision that I was going to move to an entirely new country. So I really admire Gaetano's courage in doing that. They traveled to the United States from the port of Naples in Italy. The boat that they traveled to Italy on, or to the United States on, was called the Sicilian Prince. Gaetano and his wife Angelina traveled to the United States with Angelina's younger brother. His name was Lorenzo Valerio. They left the port of Naples, headed for the United States on June 9th of 1905. The Sicilian Prince, the boat that they traveled on, had 25 first-class compartments, 0 second class, and 1,100 third class. Gaetano and his crew traveled in third class. Angelina, my grandfather would say, would tell the story of how, despite how much she loved her home country of Italy, how much she loved Italy, She said emphatically that she was never going to return because she suffered a lot of seasickness and motion sickness on that boat, the Sicilian Prince, coming over to the United States. They arrived from Naples in New York on June 27th, 1905. I would note that that's 18 days that they were out at sea on the Sicilian Prince. I had the opportunity and was fortunate to get to go to Italy this past summer. The plane ride from Atlanta to Rome was about 10 hours, approximately somewhere. And to me, that felt like a really long time. You know, I was worn out by the time I got to Italy. I cannot imagine spending 18 days at sea on a ship coming from Naples to New York. My sister, Leanne Bamer, who's here tonight, she was able to do some online research and actually found the immigration records when Gaetano and Angelina Codella arrived in New York City. Those records show that Gaetano had a small amount of money. He was met by Pasquale Codella, and he listed his final destination as Grand Avenue in Washington, D.C. When he arrived in Washington, D.C., he was met there by Leonardo Capicella, who was instrumental in helping him get established in Washington, D.C. His first endeavor in business when he was in Washington, D.C. was in the grocery business. Apparently at that time, streetcar conductors could be tipped, so to speak, to allow people to bring groceries from larger grocery stores to fruit carts and vegetable carts in smaller neighborhoods. So that's what Gaetano did. He had a fruit stand and a vegetable stand. It was in the Eastern Market area of Washington, D.C. He worked hard, the family worked hard, and they began to prosper in D.C. They had 2 children. First child was Michael Thomas Codell, who was my grandfather. Another child, a daughter, was Rosina Carmela Codell Pellicane, affectionately known as Rose. The 2 of them, the story I always heard was that they always walked to school together in Washington, D.C. Kind of an interesting commentary on those times, and also an interesting commentary on the progress we've made as a country since then. They felt like they needed to walk to school together because at that time there was prejudice against immigrants that were new to the country. So they would walk to school together so that they could be a team in case they were confronted and anybody tried to bully them. I found that story really interesting and just kind of a comment on our socioeconomic system and where we're at today and how much we've improved. Speaking of Rose, I had the pleasure of meeting Rose when I was a child. We took a vacation to New York, my immediate family, and it's really one of my favorite childhood memories. My cousin Charles Pellicane is here tonight, and got to hang out with him in New York. He took me to Chinatown. We went to some real authentic Chinese restaurants, had a great time, and got to go out to Long Island and meet Rose. I remember her as just an incredibly gracious lady. And like I said, one of my favorite childhood memories was getting to go and hang out with Charles in New York and meet Rose. Rose lived a very long life. She lived to be, Charles was telling me tonight, she lived to be 107 years old. Yeah, so great longevity. She was lucid throughout her life. When she turned 100 years old, there was a reporter that did a story on her for turning 100. She was able to give an interview and talk in detail about her family history. I've read the article. It's really fascinating from my perspective to read about people I'm related to. She recalled Gaetano Codella as a very good man. He had one of his favorite things to do was regularly conduct singing and playing music with the family on Sundays. So that was kind of his weekly ritual or routine that he enjoyed doing. Another interesting, at least to me, interesting factoid from that time period was that in southern Italy at that time, children were not required to go to school. There was no compulsory education for children in southern Italy. So a lot of the people they were friends with, Gaetano and Angelina, were immigrants from southern Italy, and they weren't necessarily the best educated. Gaetano did have an education, and he would devote his time and teach people, help people learn to read. He would read to them. One of his favorite things was to emphasize the importance of education and read Italian books that he had checked out of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. At one point, Gaetano visited Kentucky to visit his prominent brother, Pasquale Codella. At that time, Pasquale was going by James, and he had changed his last name to Codell. He explained to my great-grandfather, Gaetano, that he noticed that more business in America would come to him when he changed his name from Codella to Codell. So Gaetano followed suit. He felt like that was a pretty savvy idea, a good idea, and he did the same thing, changed his last name from Codella to Codell as well. At some point, Gaetano's son, Michael Thomas Codell, was invited by his uncle James to move to Kentucky and work in the construction industry. Michael Thomas Codell was my grandfather, and under the expert guidance and getting expert advice from James Codell, he was able to work in the construction industry in Kentucky. The company that he worked or started was MT Codell Construction Company, and it was also based here in Winchester. Worked on a lot of projects here in central Kentucky. For those of you all that are here in central Kentucky, you're probably familiar with the intersection where New Circle Road meets Winchester Road, where the bridge is there and the on-ramps and the off-ramps. That was one of his projects. I've got some kind of neat pictures from back when it was first built, showing him working on that. And it's really amazing how far out in the country that was back when it was built. But that was an example of his work, and they've reworked a lot of that here recently in the last couple of years, but that work stood for decades of time. Gaetano's granddaughters, Mary Angela Cisnera and Roseanne Pelican, remembered their mother, Rose, saying that Gaetano was a very cultured man who tried to help others and to make the world a better place. Rose told them about his efforts to help other people learn to read, his passion for learning, and for reading to other people in the Library of Congress in D.C. So it's been really interesting to me tonight to listen to everybody speak and talk about our family history. It was a fun exercise for me to read over this and review and learn about my great-grandfather and grandfather. When I look through this, really several themes jump out to me. We have a lot to live up to as descendants of these amazing people. The themes that jump out to me are themes of hard work, trying to help other people, and also being successful. So that's a lot to live up to, but when I look around this room, I think we're living up to that. So I hope at this time, in conclusion, that you all will join me in a toast. Raise your glass and toast not only to our family's great history of success, but continued success going into the future. Salute. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Last but not least, we will hear about Vincenza from her granddaughter, Sue Parada of Annapolis, Maryland. As Sue comes to the podium, I need to tell you that my efforts to locate many of the non-Kentucky-born Codells would not have been possible without this lady here. I started communicating with Sue back in 2013, and she supplied me with a chart of Vincenza's descendants. With this trove of information, I began to realize that finding other Codell descendants and getting them together for a reunion would in fact be possible. Sue has been a huge proponent of this reunion idea and has encouraged me throughout. As a side note, I need to tell you that Sue and her husband Gus make a very delicious Maryland crab cake, and I speak from experience on that. Please show your appreciation now for Sue Parada.
Well, Jimmy, I am not a public speaker, so.
Well, Sue, we have to follow 3 lawyers.
Okay, that's hard,
3
yes.
lawyers. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you all for welcoming us. This has been very emotional. Betsy and I were talking earlier, and we filled up a couple of times, so bear with me. I'm going to talk to you just shortly about my grandmother Vincenza, who she died when I was 5. Tina was 6 or 7 at the time, and but I remember stories that my Aunt Tina and my father would share with us. I remember Angelina, that was mentioned earlier, and these memories have been wonderful, and I thank all of you for this. But I want to first of all thank Kathy and Harkey today for the fabulous lunch and the tour of your beautiful women. Thank you. A big thank you to Hagen as well as to Nelda tonight for this lovely meal. And we all agree this was one of the best fried chicken as well as green beans I've had in a long time. Thank you. Needless to say, I can't thank George enough because we've developed a friendship and a closeness, and it's lovely, and Kathy as well. So thank you so much. And where am I? Okay, I have to look at my notes. I would like to, first of all, if you don't mind, to quickly introduce Vincenza's grandchildren. Her oldest grandchildren is right over here, and that's Tina. Yes, she's her oldest. Then came my brother John, and John passed away in 2018. But fortunately, we have David, my nephew, David Capicella, and his lovely wife, Michelle. So we were all Capicellas, but he's the only one carrying the name on. I will say that. I was his third grandchild. And my husband Gus is here, along with my son Michael and Danielle, as well as Dan. I'm not forgetting you, Dan. Her fourth grandchild was my cousin Jenny back there. And she's here with her husband Dave and her son David. So thank you all for coming. I haven't seen them in a while. And last but not least was our little John Thomas. He was her fifth grandson. He's here tonight with his wife Kathy. So this is wonderful for us because we all do not get together as much as we'd like to as well. It really is an honor to introduce you to our grandmother Vincenza. She came to this country in the winter of 1911 at the age of 16. I cannot begin to imagine at that age to leave your parents back in Italy knowing you might never see them again. Although she had relatives here and she had her brothers, but they had left years before that. And she really did not know them, but she came to Washington because she had an aunt and uncle, which was Leonardo and Maria, right, Gus? Yeah. And so she stayed with them, and she married my grandfather, John Capicella. The following, I think it was in November of 1911. Why did she come to Washington to begin with? At 16, you think, wait a minute, you're leaving your parents, why would you come here? I wish I had asked these questions of my father and my Aunt Tina. I wish I had the answers, but the only thing we all have, there was opportunities in this country. Her uncle Leonardo, he immigrated to the U.S. around 1893-94. And for some reason, this I really wish I knew, why did he come to Washington? Because Washington was considered a southern town as well. And there was more acceptance up in the Northeast, as we all know. But he was able to start a shoe business, 3rd and Pennsylvania Avenue, which was a pretty good location. And 3 blocks, it was 3 blocks from the Capitol. And he was a very, very good shoe repairman, as my father often said. He sent for his wife and his 4 children in 1901. And many Calitrians throughout the years came through and were sponsored by the family of Capicella. Vincenza married John Capicella, as I said, in the fall of 1911. John also worked as a shoemaker with his father, Leonardo. They had 4 children. One son was born in 1912, and his name was Leonardo, of course, because the Italian tradition is you name your firstborn son after the paternal grandfather. Leonardo died, though, in 1917 at the age of 5 at that point. And at that time, she was pregnant with my father. She had every plan to name him Michael. Sure enough, she named him Leonardo because that was the Italian tradition, and she carried it on. Unfortunately, I have little recollection of Vicenza because she died when I was only 5, as I said earlier. My cousins Tina and Ginny also, I went to them and said, do you remember? And we did have a few recollections. Based on our memories and what my dad and my Aunt Tina shared with us, she was a remarkable woman. She never missed Sunday Mass at St. Peter's Catholic Church, which was a block from the Capitol. I remember going to Mass with her as a very little girl, and I'm sure it wasn't easy. So she would take me to Mass, and I remember laying there just leaning on her, and she had a nice cushion of an arm. I remember that. And I would fight sleep because I was probably driving her crazy the night before. But she would come home from Mass. She would start in. She would make the Sunday sauce. She would make the meatballs, the sausage, and brujol. And I try to carry the tradition on today with a little difficulty. But it was an opportunity for her whole family, of course, gathered. She made, Dad used to say, she made homemade ravioli that was the best. Well, the thing is, she didn't have the machines that we use today. She used actually a broomstick to roll out all the dough, and she would make it, and that's what Sunday meal was. According to my father and my Aunt Tina, she was considered the best cook in the family. Everyone would come to her house for her food, and she always fed them well. One thing that my cousins and I do remember is her delicious pastina. I don't know, everybody has chicken soup, but in an Italian family it was pastina, tiny little pastas, chicken soup. I serve it to my family and my grandchildren, and they all love it. But Tina also remembered she had provolone hanging in the kitchen as well. So where she was able to get all this Italian food, I still am not sure, because DC was not an Italian area. There wasn't even a Little Italy in DC. My grandfather, John, was a very successful businessman, but my dad always said he was not, no, I am wrong. He was a successful shoemaker, but he was not a businessman. But my grandmother, Vincenza, was. She was the businesswoman in the family, and she was a very shrewd, smart woman when it came to saving and purchasing property. During the Depression, when everybody was suffering, fortunately for our family, they thrived. They were able to buy different homes. We call it the suburbs today, but they called it the country back then. Dad always said she knew how to stretch a dollar better than anyone he ever knew. When my dad was in high school, he would drive her to the different markets within DC, one of them being the Eastern Market. And without a doubt, she would make him stop at a field, particularly in the spring and summer. And she would stop here, and he would stop, and he would slink down. She would pick the dandelions that were out in the field. Now, needless to say, she could have bought them, but no, it was not fresh enough. Vincenza wanted the fresh dandelions that were in the fields in DC, near the Capitol. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh. Dad always said he made his friends feel welcome. She always made his friends feel welcome to her house. In fact, they must have had a happy household because my Aunt Tina, my dad, they had so many friends, and the family always gathered at Vincenza's house. Grandma Vincenza was not the mother that would go to sporting events or drive her kids around to this and that. Yet all 3 of her children succeeded in schools where they were able to be awarded scholarships in academics as well as in sports. John and Vincenza instilled in them the love of all the education that the United States offered and to be proud of their ancestry. And my grandpa John put his foot down to all of his sisters and to Vincenza. There will be no speaking Italian in this house. It has to be English. You are in the United States. And they did. They learned English. George asked me several years ago a question, and he said, how has immigration in the U.S. from Italy shaped our families? My answer? It was shown that all of our ancestors were very brave, hardworking individuals who came to this country to make something of themselves, and they didn't have their hands out and looking for help. They did it on their own. Personally, I have tried to instill this in my sons and grandchildren. When I think of my grandmother, Vincenza, I cannot imagine leaving my parents and coming to this country and do all that she did and probably never complained at all about it. As I said before, Grandpa was a successful businessman in making shoes, but it was my grandmother, Vincenza, who took care of her home, her children, and the finances, and was also the hostess to their many friends and relatives, so that my grandpa and their children could be successful in this country. George said this so well. In a greater sense, our Codella Capicella story is a story of America and its growth and development in the 20th century. I want to thank all of you for making us all feel so welcome today. Thank you.
Sue, that was amazing. Sue, that was extraordinary.
Thank you, Sue, for that wonderful presentation. Sue's presentation about Vincenza, who married into the Capicella family, raises an important point that others have made but cannot be overemphasized. The Capicellas took in our ancestors, James and Gaetano, who came to this country at young ages, as we have said, 15 and 22. James and Gaetano came with little money, and their only possessions were whatever they could fit in a suitcase. They were in a foreign country and didn't know the language. In short, they were vulnerable and needed a helping hand to get established. The Capicellas extended that hand. If the Capicellas hadn't, the stories of James and Gaetano, and ultimately the stories of us, their descendants, could have been very different. So if you have James or Gaetano on your name tag, and you see someone with Vincenza on theirs, have a thankful heart for what the parents-in-law of Vincenza, Codella Capicella, did for you and your ancestor. I'm also going to offer a toast to the ancestors of our Codell family. To our ancestors, to the ones whose success has been acknowledged, and to the ones whose love and sacrifice may not have been acknowledged or is not well known. Mary Angela, Gaetano, James, Lucia, and Vincenza, we, your thankful descendants, raise a glass here to you tonight.